The next morning, Karen discovered that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had backup. 3 more military vehicles lined Maple Street, a tactical response that made her blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels. What she didn't realize was that Rodriguez's unit had declared this Operation Neighborhood Watch, and his fellow soldiers were taking personal leave just to visit their favorite elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. This is psychological warfare, Karen declared to anyone who would listen, which was increasingly no one. Her usual allies, the other HOA board members, were mysteriously unavailable for emergency meetings. The turning point came when Karen stormed Elena Rodriguez's front door, demanding to speak to whoever was in charge of this military occupation. Elena, all 5 feet of her, stood in her doorway wearing a faded Marine Corps t-shirt that had belonged to her late husband. "Young lady," Elena said quietly, "my son and his friends are heroes who've served 3 tours overseas. They're on leave, visiting family, and parking legally on a public street. What's your excuse for harassment?" For the first time in years, Karen was speechless, but her silence didn't last long. That afternoon, she escalated to her nuclear option. She called the base commander directly, demanding disciplinary action against Rodriguez for using military resources to intimidate civilians. The conversation lasted exactly 90 seconds before the commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, hung up on her. What Karen didn't know was that Colonel Hayes was Elena Rodriguez's former daughter-in-law, and she'd been following the #HOA Karen saga with great amusement. The colonel's response was swift and devastating. She issued a press release praising Rodriguez for his outstanding community engagement and announced that Willowbrook Estates had been selected for the Army's new Adopt a Neighborhood program, which would involve regular military community service visits. Karen's world began collapsing around her. Neighbors who'd once cowered at her bylaw citations were openly laughing at her complaints. The local news ran a heartwarming segment about military families being welcomed home, with Karen portrayed as the lone dissenting voice. Her own HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss her increasingly erratic behavior. The final blow came when she discovered that Elena Rodriguez had been quietly documenting every one of Karen's violations for months. Excessive outdoor lighting, unauthorized security cameras, and, most damning of all, a decorative flag that exceeded HOA size restrictions by 2 inches. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elena said sweetly when Karen found the formal complaint in her mailbox, "I believe you once told me that rules are rules." Standing in her driveway that evening, watching Rodriguez teach neighborhood kids how to properly fold an American flag, Karen felt something she'd never experienced before. Genuine humiliation mixed with a strange, unfamiliar emotion that might have been respect. But Karen Whitmore didn't become the terror of Willowbrook Estates by backing down easily. As she watched the soldiers' easy interaction with the community she'd spent years trying to control, a new plan began forming in her mind. If she couldn't beat them, perhaps it was time to discover what she'd been fighting against all along. The question was whether Willowbrook Estates was ready for a reformed Karen, or if some wars leave permanent casualties on both sides. Karen Whitmore stood in her pristine driveway at 6:47 am, clutching her phone like a weapon as she filmed the olive-green Humvee parked across the street. "This is unacceptable," she shrieked into her phone's camera. Military vehicles do not belong in residential neighborhoods. What she didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was sitting inside that Humvee, live streaming his morning coffee routine to his battalion's group chat. And her entire meltdown was being broadcast to 200 soldiers who were about to make her famous for all the wrong reasons. The second shock came when Karen marched directly to the vehicle, rapped her manicured nails against the bulletproof glass, and demanded the soldier remove this eyesore immediately or face legal consequences. Rodriguez calmly rolled down his window and explained he was visiting his elderly mother, who lived at 1247 Maple Street, the house directly across from Karen's pristine colonial. Karen's face turned crimson. "I don't care if you're visiting the Pope himself. This vehicle violates 17 different HOA codes." The third moment that would seal her fate occurred when she actually called the police. The mayor's office, ND, the local news station, declaring that military intimidation tactics were being used against peaceful suburban residents. By noon, her voicemails had been shared across 3 different military bases, and hashtag #HOAKaren was trending on social media. Karen had been the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates for 8 years, ruling with an iron fist and a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws. She'd successfully forced neighbors to repaint mailboxes, remove garden gnomes, and replace non-compliant doorknobs. Her power came from her obsessive attention to detail and her willingness to wage war over the smallest infractions. But this military vehicle situation felt different. This felt personal. "Mrs. Rodriguez seems like such a sweet lady," Karen muttered to herself, pacing her living room. But rules are rules. She'd met Elena Rodriguez exactly once, a brief encounter where the 78-year-old woman had politely waved from her garden. Elena's late husband had been a decorated Vietnam veteran, something Karen had dismissed as irrelevant when she'd initially tried to cite Elena for her overgrown rose bushes. Now Elena's son was home on leave, and Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of test. The other neighbors were watching. If she backed down now, her authority would crumble. Rodriguez, meanwhile, was getting a crash course in suburban warfare from his mother. "Mijo, that woman once measured my grass with a ruler," Elena warned over dinner. "She sent me a formal letter because it was 3/4 of an inch too long." "Don't worry, Mama," Rodriguez chuckled. "I've dealt with worse than HOA ladies." He had no idea what he was up against. Karen spent that evening crafting what she considered her masterpiece, a 4-page formal complaint citing everything from unauthorized military presence to potential property value depreciation. She hand-delivered copies to every house on the block, expecting support. Instead, she found something she'd never encountered before: organized resistance.